Tonight, somewhere close to you, a glass is being filled. Maybe a bottle opened after a long day. Maybe a toast at a wedding, or a drink poured for a friend who finally wanted to talk. It feels modern. It feels invented by bars and breweries and advertising. But the real answer is far stranger. Your relationship with alcohol did not begin in a tavern. It did not begin with farming. It did not begin with humans at all. It began about 10 million years ago on a forest floor with a piece of fruit that had gone bad. Nobody invented alcohol. Alcohol invents itself. Yeast are single-celled fungi living on the skin of almost every ripe fruit on Earth. They eat sugar. They release carbon dioxide and ethanol as waste. And the ethanol is not a gift. It is a weapon, a poison the yeast makes to kill the bacteria competing for the same meal. So every burst fig and every fallen mango is a tiny brewery running without permission, which means alcohol existed long before anything had a mouth to drink it. Now, picture your ancestor. Not a human, something smaller and hairier, living in the trees of Africa as the forests began to thin. For a long time, that animal ate fruit up in the branches. Fresh fruit. Clean sugar. Then the climate shifted. The canopy broke apart, and more of the day was spent on the ground. And fruit on the ground is not fresh. It is bruised, split, warm, and quietly fermenting. Here's the problem. Ethanol is toxic. It damages cells and disrupts the nervous system. And for an animal that cannot process it, a belly full of fermented fruit is not a party. It is poisoning. So how did your ancestors survive the very thing that would become a ritual? In 2015, a biologist named Matthew Kerrigan reconstructed an ancient enzyme from the dead. The enzyme is called alcohol dehydrogenase 4. It sits in your mouth, your throat, and your stomach, and it is the first thing that touches ethanol when ethanol touches you. Kerrigan collected the gene from dozens of living primates, worked backward along the family tree, rebuilt the versions that existed millions of years ago, and tested them in the lab. For most of primate history, that enzyme was almost useless against ethanol. Then, around 10 million years ago, in the shared ancestor of you, chimpanzees and gorillas, a single mutation appeared. One change, one tiny swap inside the protein. That version metabolized ethanol roughly 40 times faster. Think about what that means. A door opened. Rotting fruit on the forest floor stopped being poison and started being food. Fallen fruit is more abundant than fruit in the branches. It is easier to reach. It holds more sugar, because fermentation concentrates ripeness. So the ability to handle alcohol was never a vice. It was a survival advantage. You are descended from the ones who could stomach it. Robert Dudley, a biologist at the University of California, Berkeley, has spent decades building on this idea. He calls it the drunken monkey hypothesis, and he pushes it further than tolerance. He thinks ethanol became a signal. Sugar has no smell. You cannot smell ripeness across a forest. But ethanol is volatile. It evaporates and drifts hundreds of meters through the trees. So a hungry primate does not follow the scent of fruit. It follows the scent of fermentation, because fermentation is the flag that says the calories are ready. The smell of alcohol became attractive for the oldest reason in biology. It meant food. Do you see what that implies about you? The pull is not a modern weakness, it is a 10-million-year-old navigation system, still running in a world where the fruit no longer has to be found. And this is not a human story alone. In Guinea, wild chimpanzees have been filmed crumpling leaves into sponges, dipping them into containers of fermenting palm sap and drinking. Some consumed the equivalent of several glasses of wine. Some then behaved exactly as you would expect. Nobody taught them. Nobody handed them a cup. So when did ancient humans start drinking alcohol? They never started. They inherited it. But something did change. For millions of years, drinking meant finding. You stumbled onto fermentation by luck. Then, somewhere in the last 20,000 years, a human looked at grain and water and decided to wait. In 2018, a Stanford archaeologist named Li Lu published a discovery from Rakifit Cave on Mount Carmel. Cut into the cave floor were stone mortars, and inside them lay microscopic starch residues, pitted and distorted in a very specific way. Grain that had been sprouted, mashed, heated, and fermented. Around 13,000 years old. Sit with that. Thousands of years before wheat was domesticated. Thousands of years before villages. These were hunter-gatherers, and they were brewing. And where were they brewing? Among the graves of their dead. One of the oldest traces of beer on Earth is not a party. It is a funeral. Then comes the twist that turns the story of civilization upside down. Why would anyone give up foraging for farming? It looks like an obvious upgrade. It was not. Early farmers worked longer hours, stood shorter, had worse teeth, and more disease. And raw grain is a miserable food, hard to grind and hard to digest. So why chain yourself to a field for that? Unless the grain was never really for bread. In 1986, the anthropologist Solomon Katz argued exactly that. Ferment the grain and everything changes. The yeast adds nutrients. The alcohol makes the liquid safer than standing water. The calories become easier to drink than to chew. And the drink does something no loaf has ever done. It relaxes a room full of strangers. Katz suggested the desire for beer may have helped push humans to plant seeds in the first place. Not hunger. Thirst. Most archaeologists still think food came first and beer followed close behind. The debate is unsettled, but the fact that it is a real debate should tell you how deep this runs. Everywhere humans went, they did this anyway. Rice and honey in China 9,000 years ago, confirmed by the biomolecular archaeologist Patrick McGovern. Grapes in the Caucasus, agave in Mexico, honey in Africa, different continents, different plants. No contact between them. The same idea, over and over. What are the odds of that, unless the impulse was already inside the animal? And then evolution began pushing back. Once alcohol became common instead of rare, tolerance stopped being a pure advantage. Across East Asia, in the same window when rice cultivation spread, gene variants rose sharply that make ethanol unpleasant. Red face, racing heart, nausea after a single drink. Your ancestors evolved to seek alcohol out. Then some of their descendants began evolving a reason to stop. There is one last thing your body was never prepared for. Fermentation has a natural ceiling. Yeast dies in its own waste somewhere around 15%. For 10 million years, that ceiling protected you. Fallen fruit is 1 or 2%. The oldest beers, a little more. Then, about 1,000 years ago, humans learned to distill, to boil the alcohol out and catch it as it cooled. In one step, the ceiling was gone. Your enzymes were tuned for bruised fruit on a forest floor. They were handed 40% spirits, on demand, at any hour, with no season and no walk through the trees to reach it. That gap between the body you inherited and the world you live in is not a moral failing. It is a mismatch, 10 million years of scarcity, meeting a shelf that is never empty. And still, look at what stayed. Notice that the glass appears at weddings and funerals and reunions, at the exact moments when a group of humans needs to lower its guard with each other. The brewers of Rakafet worked beside their dead. The chimpanzees passed the palm sap around in a group. The drink was never really about the drink. It was about what happens between the people holding it. So tonight, somewhere close to you, a glass is being filled. It is not a modern habit. It is the end of a line running back through every toast and every wake, past the first farmers, past a burial cave on Mount Carmel, all the way to one ancestor who bent down and ate the fruit everyone else was afraid of. That glass was poured 10 million years ago. You have simply been finishing it ever since.